Seoul's most feared shadow was fading. The poison was designed to be absolute, a molecular death sentence that should have ended the Lee bloodline forever. But the assassins who left him in that smoke-filled alley didn't count on one thing: the girl who was never supposed to exist. Lee Junseok wasn't supposed to be mortal. To his rivals, he was a ghost. To his men, he was an untouchable king. Tonight, the immortal slumped against a cold stone wall, his black suit stained, and his breathing shallow as the world turned to gray. Within the hour, his empire began to fracture, his lieutenants already whispering about a successor, as the light in his eyes dimmed. No one noticed the small, quiet figure approaching through the haze. Nyla Brooks moved with a calm that defied her 6 years, her small hand reaching toward the man the world feared most. From 10 yards away, her mother, Renee, froze in silent horror, her hands pressed to her mouth to stifle a scream. She had spent a decade running from this man, rebuilding her life from nothing to keep her daughter safe from his darkness. Now, her worst nightmare was unfolding in front of her eyes. As Junseok's heart gave its final, faltering beat, Nyla didn't flinch. She placed a tiny hand over his chest. In that moment, a warm, golden light erupted from her palms, taking the shape of a glowing heart that pulsed in perfect rhythm with the man beneath her. The poison didn't just fail, it retreated. Junseok's eyes snapped open, looking into the face of the child who had just saved him. He didn't know her name, and he didn't know she was his blood. He only knew that the darkness was gone, replaced by a light he didn't deserve. The real question wasn't just how she saved him. It was what would happen to the girl now that the underworld knew she existed. The neon lights of the city felt 1,000 miles away from the damp, narrow throat of the alleyway where Lee Junseok now lay. He was the man they called the Immortal, a shadow that had ruled the Seoul underground with a whisper that could silence a room. But tonight, that shadow was dissolving into the concrete. The ambush had been surgical, a betrayal from within the ranks he thought he controlled, leaving him alone as the smoke from the flash charges swirled around his slumped form like a funeral shroud. The poison was an engineered neurotoxin, a molecular death sentence designed to bypass every modern antidote. It burned through his veins, a cold fire that turned his legendary discipline into a series of violent, involuntary tremors. His custom-tailored black suit was ruined, pressed against the stained brick, as he struggled to pull air into lungs that felt as though they were filling with lead. Above him, the sky was a bruised purple, indifferent to the fall of a king. A few yards away, the men who had done this paused. They didn't check for a pulse. They didn't need to. The Swiss-engineered toxin had a perfect record, 2 documented cases, 2 documented funerals. They adjusted their cuffs, exchanged a look of cold professional satisfaction, and melted back into the darkness of the city. To them, Lee Junseok was already a ghost, a remnant of a transition plan that was now complete. Junseok felt his heart falter, the rhythm stuttering like a dying engine. His vision began to tunnel, the edges of the alleyway blurring into an infinite, suffocating black. He had built an empire on the idea that he was untouchable, but as the irreversible toxin reached his core, he realized he was just a man dying in the dirt. He closed his eyes, expecting the final silence. He didn't expect the soft scrape of a shoe against the pavement or the sudden, inexplicable shift in the air. He didn't expect the smell of rain-washed earth to cut through the chemical sting of the smoke. In the last second before his heart stopped, he felt a presence, something small, something gentle, and something impossibly warm. The dying lion was at the end of his breath, unaware that the one thing the Mafia could never account for, pure, unvarnished compassion, was standing right beside him. The silence that followed the assassin's departure was heavy, broken only by the wet, ragged hitch of Lee Junseok's failing breath. He was slipping into the gray space where the physical world ends, his heart fluttering against his ribs like a trapped bird. But then, the shadows at the mouth of the alley shifted. Nyla Brooks stepped forward, her small, pink-laced shoes making no sound against the damp pavement. She was a quiet, observant child who saw the world not through the lens of power, but through the frequency of pain. To her, the man slumped against the brick wasn't a titan of the underworld. He was simply a person whose chest hurt, and because he hurt, she did too. She knelt beside him, her expression a mix of solemnity and a compassion that reached far beyond her 6 years. As her hands hovered inches above his ruined black suit, a soft, amber warmth began to radiate from her palms. It wasn't the harsh flash of a siren or the cold glare of a streetlight. It was a gentle, organic glow that smelled of earth after rain. As she closed her eyes, focusing all her love and fear into her fingertips, the light intensified, coalescing into the unmistakable shape of a glowing golden heart. The moment her skin touched his, The resonance was immediate. Junseok's body, which had been locked in the rigid grip of the neurotoxin, suddenly went supple. The golden heart pulsed, sending ripples of restorative energy through his ravaged nervous system, neutralizing the synthetic venom at the molecular level. His heart, which had finally stuttered into a terrifying flatline, felt the kick of her life force, one beat then another. The rhythm returned, not weak or thready, but steady and resonant, as if his pulse was syncing with hers. Nyla didn't pull away, even as the light burned brighter, illuminating the dark ink on his skin and the tears of the woman watching from the shadows. In that alleyway, the immortal was reborn, not through the strength of his empire, but through the touch of a child whose blood called out to his own. Junseok's lungs expanded, taking in a deep, clean breath of air, his eyes flickering open to find the golden glow reflected in the dark, familiar depths of Nyla's gaze. From the mouth of the alley, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Renee Brooks stood frozen, her hands clamped over her mouth to keep her soul from screaming. She had spent 10 years building a fortress of anonymity, changing her name, her city, and her very life to ensure her daughter would never breathe the same air as the syndicate. But there, bathed in the impossible golden light of Nyla's touch, was the one man who could tear it all down. The features she had tried so hard to erase from her memory were now illuminated by her daughter's gift. The sharp, disciplined line of his jaw, the controlled power, even in his unconscious state, and the eyes she knew would be terrifying once they opened. It was Lee Junseok, the father Nyla had never known and the shadow Renee had successfully outrun until this exact, heart-stopping second. Her legs finally moved, a frantic, stumbling run that brought her to Nyla's side. "Nyla, baby, stop, we have to go," she hissed, her voice trembling with a primal, maternal panic. She reached for her daughter's shoulder, desperate to break the connection, but the air around them felt thick, charged with a biological resonance she didn't understand. Nyla didn't pull away. She looked up at her mother with wide, calm eyes, her hands still glowing with that warm, heartbeat-sinking light. Renee looked down at Junseok and saw the color returning to his face, the lethal gray of the toxin receding. Her mind raced through a decade of secrets. The old photo she'd sworn was destroyed, the pregnancy she'd kept hidden as she fled across borders, and the terrifying truth that her daughter's power was now tied to the very man who would inadvertently draw the underworld to their doorstep. The decade of safety had been an illusion. The hiding streak was over. As Junseok's fingers twitched against the concrete, Renee realized that by saving his life, Nyla had inadvertently signed their names in blood once again. The immortal was waking up, and the quiet life Renee had fought so hard to protect was already beginning to burn. The hum of the medical monitors in the underground clinic was a rhythmic, artificial heartbeat that tethered Lee Junseok back to the world of the living. When his eyes finally opened, the harsh clinical white of the ceiling felt like a physical weight against his retinas. He was alive, a fact that defied every law of the toxicology reports he had spent a lifetime studying. As the fog of the irreversible neurotoxin cleared, it was replaced by a strange, magnetic sensation in his chest, a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in time with a presence nearby. He turned his head slowly, his muscles protesting the movement, and found her. The child sat in a chair by the corner, her small hands folded in her lap, watching him with a gaze that was terrifyingly familiar. In the cold, sterile light of the safe room, Junseok saw the reflection of his own soul in her dark eyes, the same unwavering focus, the same quiet resilience that had allowed him to build an empire from nothing. He had spent years ruling through fear and distance, but this child possessed a gravity that pulled at the very center of his being. How? His voice was a jagged rasp, the word barely catching the air. He remembered the alleyway, the smoke, and the sudden, impossible warmth that had reached into the vacuum of his dying heart. He looked at the girl's palms, now resting innocently against her pink dress, and felt the resonance grow stronger. It wasn't just gratitude, it was a biological recognition, a tether of blood and energy that bridged the decade-long gap Renee had fought so hard to maintain. Nyla didn't speak, but as she tilted her head, the air in the room seemed to soften, the pull intensifying, until Junseok felt a phantom heat over his heart. He realized then that the girl wasn't just a miracle. She was a mirror. Every calculation he had made, every betrayal he had survived, paled in comparison to the revelation unfolding in the quiet of the clinic. He didn't believe in fate, but as he watched her, the man who believed in nothing but blood realized he was looking at his own legacy. And for the first time in his life, the immortal boss felt a flicker of true, human vulnerability. The sterile air of the clinic felt increasingly pressurized as Renee stood between the medical bed and the daughter she had spent a lifetime shielding. Lee Junseok was no longer the dying man in the alley. Even pale and tethered to monitors, his presence began to fill the room with a terrifying, quiet gravity. He didn't shout or threats. He simply watched Nyla with a focused intensity that made the biological resonance in the room hum like a live wire. "You're shaking, Renee," Junseok said, his voice a low, raspy vibration that seemed to pull at the very foundations of the life she had built. "You didn't just happen to be in that alley. And a child doesn't possess that kind of light, that kind of life, unless it was meant for a specific bloodline." Renee felt the walls closing in. The 10-year-old fortress of her anonymity was crumbling under the weight of his gaze and the undeniable truth of Nyla's glowing palms. She reached into the hidden pocket of her bag, her fingers trembling as they brushed against a worn, laminated edge. With a jagged exhale, she pulled out the old photo she had swore she'd destroyed 1,000 times, a snapshot from a lifetime ago, showing a younger Junseok and a pregnant Renee in a rare moment of peace. She held it out, not as a gift but as a confession. "I ran because I knew what this world would do to her," Renee whispered, her voice breaking the heavy silence. "I ran the moment I realized that being your daughter would be a death sentence or a cage. I didn't want her to be a miracle for your syndicate. I wanted her to be a child." Junseok took the photo, his fingers brushing Renee's in a brief, electric contact that bridged a decade of silence. He looked from the faded image to the girl sitting quietly in the corner, and then back to Renee. The realization hit him with more force than the neurotoxin ever could. The immortal boss, who had built an empire on calculated coldness, was looking at the only piece of himself that was actually worth saving. The truth was finally out in the open, hanging in the air like wood smoke. Nyla wasn't just a healer who had stumbled upon a dying man. She was the heir to a throne she didn't want, saved by a father who had never known her name. As Junseok clutched the photo, the resonance in his chest stabilized into a heavy, protective ache. He finally understood why Nyla's power felt so familiar. It was the heartbeat of his own blood, refined into a light he was now terrified he would extinguish. The digital silence of the Syndicate Central Command was broken by a single, flickering data point that shouldn't have existed. Across the city, in a high-rise fortress of glass and steel, the architects of the coup stared at a biometric feed that had miraculously spiked back to life. The neurotoxin was a masterpiece of molecular destruction. It did not leave survivors, yet the immortal was breathing, and the energy signature captured by a nearby street-level sensor during the ambush showed something even more impossible: a localized surge of golden, restorative frequency. The realization swept through the room like a cold draft. This wasn't a medical recovery. It was a phenomenon. "The boss isn't the priority anymore," the rival chairman murmured, his eyes fixed on the grain of the security playback where a small, glowing hand was visible for a fraction of a second against Lee Junseok's chest. To men who dealt in death, a child who could undo it was the ultimate commodity. Nyla Brooks had transitioned from a witness to a weapon, a living antidote that could make any army invincible. In the secret clinic, the air suddenly grew heavy with the static of an approaching storm. Junseok felt it first, the shift in the building's vibration, the subtle change in the frequency of the resonance he shared with Nyla. He sat up, the monitors chirping in a frantic rhythm as he tore the IV lines from his bruised arm. He looked at Renee, whose face had gone ghostly pale as she tracked his gaze toward the reinforced steel door. She didn't need to be told. The shadows she had outrun for 10 years were no longer looking for her past. They were hunting her daughter's future. "They aren't coming to finish the job on me," Junseok said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, protective register. He stood, his legs unsteady, but his will anchored by the small girl who was now watching the door with an eerie, knowing stillness. The retrieval team was already on the move, specialized units that bypassed the usual channels of underworld warfare. They didn't want a corpse, they wanted the miracle. Renee scooped Nyla into her arms, her maternal instinct flaring into a desperate, white-hot shield. But as the distant thud of a breaching charge echoed through the concrete levels above, she looked at the man she had once loved and saw something new. The dying lion had found something worth more than his empire. He wasn't reaching for his weapon to regain his throne. He was reaching for it to ensure that the light in Nyla's hands would never be forced to heal a monster again. The vibrations of the heavy breaching charges above sent a fine dust raining from the clinic's reinforced ceiling. But inside the room, a different kind of pressure was building. Lee Junseok stood between the door and his family, his body still map-marked, by the lingering traces of the toxin, yet his posture was anchored by a newfound clarity. He watched Nyla, whose small face was tight with a concentration that mirrored his own. As the distant sound of the retrieval team grew closer, the air in the room began to shimmer with a low, golden hum. Junseok reached back, his hand finding Nyla's shoulder. The moment their skin met, the resonance didn't just hum, it roared. He felt a surge of vitality that the medical monitors couldn't track, a borrowed strength that flowed directly from the girl's heart to his own. It wasn't a tactical advantage, it was an emotional bridge. He realized then that Nyla's power wasn't a mechanical gift to be switched on or off. It was a living extension of her bond with him, a light that burned brighter the more he chose to stand as her shield. "Stay behind me," he whispered, his voice no longer a rasp, but a command that carried the weight of a decade of lost time. Renee gripped Nyla tighter, watching the man she had once fled become the only thing standing between her daughter and a life of exploitation. The retrieval team reached the final door, the screech of metal under pressure filling the hallway, but Junseok didn't flinch. He wasn't fighting for a throne or a title anymore. He was fighting for the quiet, observing child who had pulled him back from the edge of the grave. Every time Nyla's fear spiked, the golden glow in the room pulsed, feeding into Junseok's resolve. He saw the terror in her eyes and felt it transform into a white-hot protective instinct in his chest. The dying lion had made his choice. He would use his remaining strength not to rule, but to ensure this door never opened to those who would turn his daughter's compassion into a weapon. As the door finally buckled, the room was blinded by a sudden, protective flare of gold, the resonance of a father and daughter finally recognizing each other in the dark. The cold, clinical air of the Syndicate's Central Command did not greet Lee Junseok with the usual subservience. It met him with a heavy, suffocating silence. He walked through the glass and steel corridors, not as a returning king, but as a man haunted by the golden light of a child who was never supposed to exist. Every digital eye in the building was fixed on him, searching for the weakness the toxin should have carved into his soul, but they found only a terrifying, quiet clarity. Junseok bypassed the council chambers and headed straight for the server core, the subterranean heart where every debt, every name, and every black market route was digitized into an eternal ledger. He knew that as long as this infrastructure existed, Nyla would never be safe. She was a living antidote, a miracle that men of his kind would eventually try to cage and harvest. To save the daughter, he had to execute a suicide play, not of his body, but of his legacy. With a series of encrypted commands, he began the systematic erasure of his own empire. Financial redirections moved billions into anonymous humanitarian trusts, and logistics manifests were overwritten with gibberish. He watched the screens flicker, as 10 years of Renee's hiding were finally validated by his own hand. He was burning the throne he had spent a lifetime building, turning the immortal boss into a digital ghost. The tension reached its breaking point as the architects of the coup realized what he was doing. Those who had seen the flare of Nyla's power, those few who held the secret of the miracle child, were dealt with through a cold, administrative finality. He did not seek a crown, he sought an exit. By the time the sun began to bleed over the Seoul skyline, the syndicate was a hollowed-out shell, its records purged, and its secrets buried under layers of unrecoverable code. Junseok stood in the wreckage of his power, feeling the resonance in his chest steady into a quiet ache. He had dismantled the world that would have hunted her, choosing to become a shadow so that she could stay in the light. The dying lion had finally finished the job, not by ruling the darkness, but by ensuring it could never find its way back to the girl with the golden heart. The years that followed the collapse of the Lee Syndicate were quiet, measured in the rhythm of school bells and the mundane beauty of a life lived in the light. Seoul had moved on from the legend of the immortal boss, its headlines now filled with the sudden, anonymous surge of humanitarian funding that had begun to transform the city's most neglected corners. For Nyla Brooks, the world was no longer a place of hiding or smoke-filled alleys, but a canvas of ordinary days. She grew taller, her laughter becoming a frequent, bright sound in the small apartment Renee had turned into a true home, far from the reinforced steel doors of the past. Renee watched her daughter with a peace that had been hard-won. A decade of fear finally settled into a watchful, appreciative calm. She knew the records were gone, the names purged, and the throne burned to ash by the only man who could have dismantled it from within. The life she had fought for was finally hers, and yet she knew they were never truly alone. Nyla still felt the resonance. It was no longer the frantic, heart-stopping roar of a survival bond, but a steady, protective hum that lived in the center of her chest. Sometimes, while walking home from school or sitting in a quiet park. A sudden warmth would bloom over her heart, a familiar, magnetic pulse that didn't belong to the air around her. She would pause, tilting her head as she had once done in a sterile clinic, and look toward the long shadows of the city. She never saw him clearly, just the occasional silhouette of a man in a simple jacket, standing at the edge of a crowd or watching from a distant balcony. He was a ghost by choice, a guardian who had traded his empire for the right to watch her thrive from the darkness. Lee Junseok remained a shadow, but he was a shadow that held the perimeter of her peace. As Nyla reached for her mother's hand, her own palm gave a faint, almost imperceptible golden flicker, a silent signal sent back into the quiet of the city. The dying lion had found his redemption in the distance, and the girl with the golden heart lived on, knowing that the pulse of the future was anchored by a father who loved her enough to stay invisible. The saga of Lee Junseok and Nyla Brooks is more than a story of survival. It is a blueprint for the power of choice over bloodlines. As the sun sets over the Han River, the immortal boss remains a shadow, a man who chose to burn a throne of glass to build a foundation of gold for a daughter he can only love from a distance. If this journey of a dying lion and a girl with a golden heart touched you, then the story isn't over yet. Join the movement of AfroKorean Grit Stories. Subscribe to ensure you never miss a chapter of these high-stakes, cross-cultural redemptions. Like this video if you believe that compassion is a stronger superpower than any weapon of war. Comment with the word restoration if you believe that our past doesn't have to define our children's future. I'll be in the comment section waiting to hear your thoughts. What is one choice you've been avoiding that could change someone's entire world?